Former TCU coaching legend Dutch Meyer famously said, "Fight him till hell freezes over, then fight him on the ice." Well, it might be getting a little bit frosty because Gary Patterson is a Baylor Bear. We'll talk about it next here on the Locked On Horned Frogs.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Gary Patterson has joined the Baylor coaching staff. That's right. You heard that right. If you're watching on YouTube, you were seeing this correctly. You were hearing things correctly. Former TCU coaching legend Gary Patterson is now on staff with the Baylor Bears. Colt Barber from Stickum 365, he reported this earlier today. Dave Aranda is set to hire former TCU head coach Gary Patterson as a senior level strategic consultant. Stickum 365 is confirmed through a source. He went on to list Gary's many accomplishments at TCU, and he'll be doing some scouting for Baylor's opponents and also some self-scouting for Baylor's offense and defense, getting them prepared for the teams they're playing, also trying to clue in on what tendencies they're showing other teams on film. It's pretty similar to what he did at Texas as an analyst. It's an off-the-field position, but it's still really bizarre, right? And I have a lot of mixed emotions about this as I sit here on Thursday afternoon and talk about it. So, for starters, Gary was fired by TCU. He's let go, parted ways, whatever. We all know what happened. The team was flailing. They were bad. They were coming off an embarrassing loss to Kansas State, on their way to a losing season. And really the last few years of his tenure, if you take out that COVID 2020 season where they won 5 of their last 6 and they were really strong down the stretch. Now, for the most part, they beat teams that they should have beat. The only surprising win in that kind of 5-game, it wasn't totally a winning streak because they did drop that one game to West Virginia, but the only surprising win in that upswing at the end of that season was against Oklahoma State at home to end the year. Now, they ended up scheduling that kind of makeup game against Louisiana Tech, but that was their last Big 12 game of the conference season. And so that was what got him another opportunity in 2021. And of course, they ended up going 5-7. He didn't make it through the whole season. They decided to part ways. Jerry Kill takes over, and then Sonny Dykes comes in as the head coach. So Gary was let go by TCU. I know he was upset about that, and he's made it known after that happened that he still thinks he has great coaching in him. I mean, he built the program to a certain extent, or at least revitalized it and revived it after a couple of decades where there just wasn't much juice there. All that's true. I mean, TCU's not in the Big 12 without Gary Patterson. They have a Rose Bowl win because of him and because of obviously also the players that were on those teams and increased booster support and athletic staffing that got after it and raised the level of TCU athletics to a point where now they are in the Power 4. And they don't play for a national championship in 2022 without what he built. There's a statue of him outside the stadium. All that's clear, right? And he can do what he wants now. But it's hard not to think that this is personal. The Texas job, it made sense. Chris Del Conte, the AD there, obviously that they have that relationship. And yeah, okay, Texas is a rival, but there's an opportunity for you to go there. And it always felt like that was a 1-year type of thing. It wasn't a long-term commitment. It was just, you're going to be there for a year. You're going to help them out, figure out what you want to do, maybe post-coaching or maybe figure out if you want to continue coaching, and then you move on. I lived with that, and it was fine, and I didn't really take much offense to it. But Baylor, it's just so crazy. It's such an insane world. And yes, Kaz Kazadi's on staff at TCU. Kendall Briles is now on staff at TCU. That's definitely bizarre. And now we add one more wrinkle to it, which is Gary Patterson being a coach for the Baylor Bears. Now, Dave Aranda has a ton of respect for Gary. I think it's a good hire for Baylor. I mean, what they're asking him to do is what he specializes in. Finding tendencies on other teams, doing some game planning. It's what he did effectively at Texas for one season. Now, I don't know how much input he really had on that defense and how much credit he deserves for what they did. But this past season, they were really good. Of course, he wasn't there anymore, but it seems like he was part of building that thing back to a place where they were a team that was in playoff contention again. It's just so crazy. And I talked about this on Twitter today. A decade ago, you could argue, and some people will roll their eyes, like people that Auburn, Alabama fans that live in the Iron Bowl, they will, thumb their nose at this. So will Michigan and Ohio State fans. And there's a number of great rivalries in college football. But there was a short time, really in 2014 and 2015, but honestly from 2012 through 2015, where you could argue there was not a more heated rivalry in college sports than Baylor and TCU. And it was mainly predicated on the fact that, there was a lot of history there, and TCU was coming back in the Big 12, and there's similarities with the schools, and they're very close together. But a lot of the juice in those years came down to the fact that Art Briles and Gary Patterson hated each other. They did not like each other. Now, publicly, they tried to massage it and be like, oh, no, we have respect for one another, and both teams are great, and yada, yada. But, Gary publicly called out Art multiple times. They didn't get along. The 2014 game introduced a whole new series of bad blood to it because both teams were great, and TCU lost that game. And then 2015, it was on one of the last weeks of the season. I think it was the last week of the season for TCU. Baylor might have had one more game after that. But they played in that monsoon, and they played in overtime. And TCU, everything was building to that rematch against Baylor. And even despite the elements, it was a great football game, and TCU won. And Gary and Art kind of got into it post-game, and they did not get along, to the point that I remember hearing the story, I think it was before the 2015 season. All the Big 12 coaches were doing, I don't really even know if they do this anymore because of the way media has changed, but they used to call it the car wash, where all the coaches go down there, they do a Sports Center interview, they do a couple radio shows, College Football Live, a bunch of 5 or 6 minute interviews previewing the season, talking about the conference, right? So everybody's there, and there was a short window of time where Gary and Art were in the same hallway, and they didn't even look at each other or acknowledge each other. That's how bad it had gotten between those two. And of course, the story took a lot of twists and turns. The scandal happens at Baylor. The news comes out that, the scandal had been happening. Art was at the helm there. He gets fired and essentially blacklisted from coaching, rightly so. And then a few years, Gary stays on as TCU's head coach. And post that personal rivalry, things kind of toned down a little bit. It's still a big deal. They're still rivals. It's now called the Bluebonnet Battle or whatever. But Jim Grobe came in, and Jim and Gary got along fine. And then Matt Rule was there. And, Matt was very, he was very cognizant of how people perceived him. And most coaches are. But Matt Rule was very aware of what people thought of him and the image that he was projecting. And I think he made a point to always give off a likable vibe. So he wasn't going to start beef with anybody. And I think after the that triple overtime loss that TCU had at home against Baylor in the 2019 season, Gary said something to the effect in the postgame of it's good that both programs have respect for each other now. So he sort of alluded to the bad relationship that was there in those years. But the coaches didn't like each other. The teams were amazing. And there was a 3 or 4 year period where it felt like that could be the new rivalry, the new standard bearing type rivalry in this league. And now here we are a decade later, and it's all changed. So yeah, Gary's free to do what he wants. And I think he'll do a good job there. But it's hard not to think that this is still just him trying to get back at TCU for how everything went down. the fact that he went to Texas and now he's at their main rival in Waco, I just get that sense that this is him really trying to prove something, which that's his right to do it. And it's also our right as fans to be upset about it. And it's funny and bizarre at the same time. There's another angle of this, though, that I find intriguing. And actually, my mom brought this up to me first. My mom's a Baylor grad. And I saw Drake Toll mention it, too, from Locked On Big 12. Sorry, Drake. Debbie Simcox beat you to it. But she texted me when she heard the news. And, of course, she was like, yeah, this is bizarre. But then she ended it with, if we need a head coach in the near future, of course, Gary's now there. And Gary told my old radio partner, Matt Mosley, this offseason, he made it really clear. He was like, he wants to be a head coach. That's still his desire. He thinks he has that in him. He's not ready to just retire and go play golf and do music and all those things. And he made a point to say that when he took the Texas job, a lot of people just thought, okay, this is just him taking some time for himself and staying in the game, but also having more opportunities to do, the charity work he's involved with, be with his family, all this different interests that he has. But he said, no, that was a year of self-reflection, evaluation. He really worked hard to evaluate, okay, what is Steve Sarkisian and his staff doing? How do they handle recruiting? How do they handle organization? How do they handle game planning? How are we doing it at TCU? And comparing those things and trying to figure out, okay, what did Texas do really well? What can I take from what they're doing? What did we do well? What should I just sort of make sure that I continue to implement because I thought we did that better? And he made those comparisons all year long. And he wanted a head coaching job this offseason. Now, to my knowledge, there wasn't much interest. I don't think he got an interview. I remember his name being thrown around when the Houston job came open because it just made sense with his Texas ties and the way he rebuilt TCU's program, go down to Houston, do a similar thing. But it never really, nothing materialized there. I don't think he even got an interview. And then didn't really hear anything else about what his possibilities would be in the head coaching realm. So now he's at Baylor. And I think Baylor's going to be better this year. They went and got DeQuan Finn, the Toledo quarterback, who is coming off a really great season. Dave Aranda's calling plays. And now he's bringing in Gary to be a sounding board for him. But if for some reason things go south and they need an interim head coach, well, they now have someone with a ton of experience who could slip into that role. As crazy as that would be if he were down on the field. Because honestly, this is a big story. This is still an off-the-field role. So I think once the season starts, we'll hear about it. And that game between TCU and Baylor, it's going to be an outstanding storyline. But, you're not going to see – I don't anticipate that you'll see Gary standing right next to Dave Aranda on the sideline week in and week out, right? That's not the job here. So I'm kind of hurt, man. I really am. I understand there's a double standard there because, yeah, there's Baylor people that were part of that Briles staff that are now on staff at TCU. And I made my feelings known about how I didn't think it was a good idea to hire Kendall Briles. Year one was a failure on his part. It just was. Not that he can't turn it around on the field, but the results weren't good last season. There were some reasons for that. I think some of it was outside of his control, but bottom line is the results are the results. And Kaz Kazadi is at TCU, and Kaz Kazadi, he's maybe one of the most well-known strength coaches in the country. He was a very prominent figure there at Baylor while he was there. So, yeah, the TCU has guys. Carlton Buckles is on staff at TCU, and he spent time in Waco. To a certain extent, this is just the new world of college football. Drake Dabney is going to play for TCU next year, tied in for Baylor. It didn't get it didn't really grab a lot of headlines because it's baseball, but Trey Richardson went from Baylor to TCU, and he was a huge part of that team that went to Omaha. Jaden Owens, the Baylor point guard, transferred to TCU. We can go down the list. This is happening now. This is the world that we live in. But it's still strange, and it's still crazy to think about how heated things were a decade ago between these two schools, and really specifically just those people in general. And now it's all been flipped upside down. But Gary Patterson on staff at Baylor, coaching with Dave Aranda and company as a strategic consultant for that defensive staff. When we come back, some reaction to yesterday's show and an update. TCU women, they fell to Oklahoma yesterday, so we'll talk about that game. All that and more next here on Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. Super Bowl is fast approaching. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Great deal going on right now. One $5 bet gets you up to $200 in bonus bets. Again, one $5 bet gets you $200 in bonus bets. FanDuel.com/lockedon. You can download the FanDuel app as well. That deal is for new customers. Perfect time to join because there's all kinds of opportunities to bet. You can do just typical like, hey, who's going to win this game? Niners or Chiefs? Do you think Brock Purdy's going to lead the charge and get it done? Or do you feel like Patrick Mahomes will get it done again? Even though really, I think that Chiefs team is about their defense. That's what's been leading the charge this year. Or you can make prop bets. How many yards is Travis Kelce going to have? Who's going to score the first touchdown? Who's going to score a touchdown in this ball game? There's all kinds of opportunities at FanDuel.com/lockedon or the FanDuel app. And again, one $5 bet gets you $200 in bonus bets if you're a new customer. FanDuel, proud sponsor of the Locked On Network and official betting partner of the National Football League. On yesterday's show, I discussed the SEC and the Big Ten. So they have formed a partnership, and they're going to form a joint committee that will explore. They're pretty vague about what they're saying, but essentially exploring all the issues in college sports right now and the future of college sports. So NIL, right? The college football playoff, how that's going to be structured. Now, ultimately, what I think they're maybe angling towards and moving towards, they're basically flexing their muscle and trying to say, hey, we're in charge here. And if you don't fall in line and do what we want, then, it's not going to be good for you. That's part of it. But also, I think there's a world that we could be seeing in the next few years where those two conferences try to break away from the NCAA, at least in football, and say, you know what? We're good. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to have our own rules, and we're going to sort of chart what college football looks like moving forward. And where would that leave TCU? Well, at the moment, it would kind of leave them out in the cold unless they're able to find a way to get into one of those conferences through expansion in the next few years. This is, to a certain extent, speculation, but it feels like this is where we could be moving in the near future. And so we had a few responses. Henry Moore said there's nothing TCU can do about this. It's just an example of corporate greed. Yeah, I think all you can really do, and some of you mentioned it, is you just got to find a way to win and stay relevant and hope that means something. Now, I don't think that – I think that's the best thing you can do, and it's really the only thing you can do. I don't feel like, unfortunately, that's the end-all, be-all. Because to be honest, now Texas made a great response last year, and they made the college football playoff. And they finally kind of got over the hump after 15 to 20 years of kind of flailing around and not being at the top of the Big 12 anymore. But when Texas and OU joined, if it was really just about winning, that's not who the SEC would have gone and gotten. Because Texas in football have been disappointed over the past 5 to 10 years. Now, again, they turned that around this past year. Unfortunately, it's not just about winning, but that's the only thing you can really do. Another person said, you take care of business and win games. That's why I said this year is important. You need to stamp yourself as a top-notch program in the Big 12. And, yeah, I think that's correct. Obviously, regardless, I just want TCU to win. So if their best chance to compete and win is at the Big 12 level, and then you look Big 12 in some sort of kind of, lesser league, if you want to call it that, then I'm totally okay with that. And when it comes down to it, the only way that you're going to be attractive to the powers that be is by winning games. And TCU doesn't have like a crazy enrollment number to flash around, but they are in a good TV market. And so if that continues to matter, even in the world of streaming, that's another thing that you can put in your back pocket and try to promote. But it really comes down to, is it a program that's serious about winning and winning at a high level? And that's something that TCU can control, and that's really all you can control in the situation. Matt Clark mentioned that TCU has the smallest enrollment of the Power 4/Power 5 schools. Somehow with great coaching and recruiting location, they've defied these odds for the last 30 years. He thinks that unless TCU has a major booster like Phil Knight, it's going to be hard to stay in this conversation. Yeah, I mean, NIL is a huge driving factor here. Like, we want to act like it's not, but it is. I mean, these kids are making decisions based on money, like everybody else is in the world, right? And so that's a new wrinkle or new element to the recruiting conversation that I know TCU is trying their best to keep up in. But as Matt pointed out, I mean, it's a school that has money. It's just also a small school. And so there's not just endless donors and an endless pool of cash that they're able to throw around. But I do think TCU can continue to find a way to compete, especially, in the new Big 12. Jared said, I think sometimes we forget how small TCU is. When you're driving the baseball field, you blink, and next thing you know, you're at Smoothie King. Hopefully we don't get put on the back burner for athletics. Right. I mean, it's a school that's grown a lot, and I think it's an athletic program that still has a very high ceiling. But, yeah, there's some inherent challenges at TCU that other places simply don't have, and that's one thing that they're going to have to fight in this new world of realignment. But I think we have the right people in charge that care about this and that understand the way the winds are shifting and changing, and so that's a good thing. Not only at TCU, but I just think in the Big 12 as well. Like, what Brett Yormark has been doing is really special. And I don't know what his future is. Like, I'm not sure what his aspirations are, if he wants to eventually go like the pro sports route. But as long as he's overseeing the Big 12, I think that they'll at least have a seat at the table and be in the conversation. And just to be completely honest, that's not something that was really the case when Bob Bowlesby was in charge. And so that's a nice breath of fresh air for the league in general. When we come back, TCU women, they fell to Oklahoma last night. We'll break down that. It's Locked on Horned Frogs, your team every day. Talked about FanDuel earlier. Another one of our great sponsors is Gametime. If you need tickets, not just to a sporting event, even though Gametime can hook you up with tickets to basketball games, baseball games here in the near future. And if you download their app and use the code LOCKEDON, you can get $20 off your first purchase. They also have a really cool deal going on right now for the Super Bowl. So I know it's kind of late in the process, but Gametime is a perfect app to find a last-minute ticket. So don't completely tune out on me here. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Right now, all Gametime users get $100 off a big game ticket with code VEGAS100. So if you're looking for a Super Bowl ticket, that code VEGAS100 gets you $100 off. Now, listen, I know Super Bowl tickets are really expensive, but hey, $100 is nothing to sneeze at. Thank you for Gametime for having that offer. One thing that's great about Gametime, you can see exactly where you're going to sit. Like, they have that feature where you'll see what your view is going to be of the stage or the stadium or whatever the case is. They got that view from your seat. And also, they have last-minute sales, flash deals. So you don't have to feel like you're behind the game with Gametime. If you need last-minute tickets, it's the best place to go. That Gametime app, that code LOCKEDON gets you $20 off your first purchase, and then Vegas 100 will get you $100 off big game tickets. So if you're still searching for Super Bowl tickets, Gametime app is the place to go. Again, that's the Gametime app. Log on there today or download that app, official sponsor of the Locked On Network. TCU women's basketball, they went up to Norman last night. They fell 72-55. It was a close game at halftime, really a close game until about midway through the third quarter. And it's really remarkable how this team's been able to stay competitive. I mean, OU's good. They're 10-1 in Big 12 play. This game was on the road. They've stayed competitive even without, all the losses. This 5-out offensive system that they're running is working, but they've just gone through a lot of scoring droughts at times, hit that lull in the third quarter, and shot 20% from three. They were 6-29 from beyond the arc yesterday, and that's just not going to work. This team, if they're going to win, especially against really good opponents, it starts and ends with being able to hit the three because they don't have much of an inside presence. Now, one bright spot for them in this kind of new look team to a certain extent has been Sydney Harris, who dealt with injuries early in the season, but she's healthy now and good to go. She had 17 points last night. She had 23 points in their outing against Kansas. So I've said this before, but if they can find a way to get Madison Connor back and Sedona Prince back with Sydney Harris available late in the season, then possibly there's a chance to make some noise in the Big 12 tournament, because I like their potential with those three on the floor, and that gives you three really good scoring options. Also, a cool story from last night is their walk-ons that they recently added to the roster all got in the game. Ella Hamlin made an appearance, played a few minutes. Sarah Sylvester, the volleyball player who's also now playing basketball, she made an appearance and hit a free throw to get her first collegiate points. Micaiah Moore played a few minutes as well, and then Piper Davis also got out there. So that lineup got an opportunity. Unfortunately, it was because the game was out of hand and it wasn't really competitive there towards the end. But they got after it and had a huge effort against Oklahoma. The men take on Iowa State on Saturday. Big game. Going to be tough to win in Ames, but they have had the entire week with no midweek game to prepare for that Iowa State team. So that'll do it for Locked On Horned Frogs today. We'll be back on Friday. Thanks for listening to the show. We're free and available wherever it is you get your podcast.